This episode is brought to you by Vital Farms. Isn't it bullshit to have to question where your food comes from? At Vital Farms, you can trace your pasture-raised eggs all the way back to the source, the pasture. On the side of each pasture-raised carton of eggs, you'll find the name of the farm where your eggs were laid. And when you look the farm up on their website, you'll get a peek at all the sunshine, fresh air, and open space the hens enjoy. Learn more and find out where to buy them at vitalfarms.com. Vital Farms, keeping it bullshit-free.
This episode is brought to you by Kia's first 3-row all-electric SUV, the Kia EV9, with available all-wheel drive and seating for up to 7 adults, with a 0 to 60 speed that thrills you 1 minute and available reclining lounge seats that unwind you the next. Visit kia.com/EV9 to learn more. Ask your Kia dealer for availability. No system, no matter how advanced, can compensate for all driver error and or driving conditions. Always drive safely.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. That's the sound of switching your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling. Harness the best converting checkout and same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Stop leaving sales on the table. Discover why millions trust Shopify to build, grow, and run their business. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech23.
This episode is brought to you by Klaviyo, the platform that powers smarter digital relationships. With Klaviyo, you can activate all your customer data in real time, connect seamlessly with your customers across all channels, guide your marketing strategy with AI-powered insights, recommendations, and automated assistance, deliver experiences that feel individually designed at scale, and grow your business faster. Power smarter digital relationships with Klaviyo. Learn more at klaviyo.com/Spotify. That's KLAVIYO.com/Spotify.
Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts.
Welcome to the podcast. In this podcast episode, I talk with Cormac Russell about his book, The Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth, and Power of Neighborhoods. Cormac Russell, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you, John. Good to be with you.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Dublin. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about your recent book, The Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth, and Power of Neighborhoods. I love this. We were talking in the pre-interview in my faculty role here at the university. I'm in the organizational leadership department. I'm chair and I teach and do research in the areas of organizational leadership and people management, but I also am the academic director of our Center for Social Impact, and we do all sorts of really cool programming around social impact issues and various pathways of impact. And this community connection piece is essential. The relational care component of connecting with the community, listening to living experts, and all of those sorts of things to inform the work that we do is absolutely essential. So some in the audience might be thinking, this is an organizational leadership podcast. Why are you talking about community? Why are you talking about neighborhoods? Now, certainly, if we zoom out a little bit, hopefully you'll see the application. Our organizations exist within the context of broader communities. So if we're trying to drive any sort of impact through our organization, we have to connect with communities in effective ways. Hopefully, it'll become increasingly obvious how important it is for us to develop a sense of connected community within our organizations as well. So within and then connecting out, all of this will lead to more sustainable programs and initiatives, and allow us to have a better, more far-reaching impact in whatever avenue we're shooting for within our organization. So that's what we'll be exploring together today. As we get started, I wanted to share Cormac's bio with everybody. Cormac Russell is a social explorer, author, speaker, and managing director of Nurture Development. He sits on the faculty of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at DePaul University of Chicago. Thank you again for joining us. Anything you would like to highlight by way of your background or personal context before we dive on it?
Not at all, John. I just really resonated with what you were sharing there at the opening and saying that actually community is whatever you say it is. And it's an experience that you can have in so many different contexts. And in this conversation, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to help people see just how powerful it is if you think about your organizational contribution through the lens of ABCD and through the lens of community.
That actually leads really well into my first question. What do you mean by community? It can mean a lot of things. It can mean something different to everyone. As you know, in your work with the ABCD at DePaul, what do you mean by connected community? And maybe provide some examples.
It's such a key question. And of course, I suppose it's important that we honor and don't minimize the fact that community means very different things for different people. So this isn't about imposing my definition on anybody. But I think it's helpful to think about, often we're talking about the idea here, the concept of community. And I think that can tie us in knots. We could spend forever talking about what is community. I think a more useful question to ask is, where is community for you? And place, or at least space, within which we have experience matters. So I think it's important to think about community as a verb. It's something we do in place with others. That can be online. Ideally, at some point, we come off the internet and we're on land with people, but it can happen in different spaces. So I think it's a verb. I also feel that it's about being relational. It's about being in a related context, or at least in a related conversation with others. And I think the other piece that's really important, for me at least, is that community is the space where we can welcome the stranger at the edge.
I really like that. Welcome the stranger at the edge. Can you unwrap that a little bit more? I know it elicited certain ideas and meaning to me as soon as you said that, but I would love to hear a little bit more of what you think about that.
I think that perhaps sometimes the word community can be misinterpreted. So we can use it to mean things that in fact are the opposite of certainly what I mean by community. So we can use it to describe how people sometimes close in and just organize around folks that are like them, and to exclude those that are in their mind not like them. So it's very much a process of othering. And certainly people who have experienced being pushed to the edge and have been actively or continue to be actively marginalized, oppressed, suffer structural racism, would say that many of their experiences of community are people closing life in on themselves and away from them. So I think it's really important to talk about community as permeable. So communities by definition have an invisible ring that say these folks are in and everybody else is out. I think the other way of thinking about community is that, yes, we can certainly invite small gatherings and small relatedness, but we can also actively say, there's an empty chair at the table and we welcome you in. And in fact, ideally, if you're dissenting, if you have a difference of opinion, if you think or act differently, we're particularly curious to welcome you. So I think that really matters. And that's what I mean by welcome the stranger at the edge.
Yeah, I love it. And that's really the crux of what an inclusive community is all about, right? If you develop a community, whether it's a neighborhood or an organization, whatever the specific context you're talking about, if you create a welcoming community that's inclusive in that way, where there's a true sense of belonging, one of the nice things about community is there is a sharedness that happens within communities, and people know how to relate to each other, and there's shared meaning, all those sorts of things. But to your point, like if you close it in and you box it in too much and you make it too rigid, you're keeping all of the people who don't strictly, conform to a prescribed set of norms and values. You're really artificially limiting the scope and scale of that community. In the modern age, where we know that diversity is important, we know that it helps organizations function better. We know that communities are better served when they have diverse voices that feel safe to share. I think it just is a good reminder to us always that having a seat at the table and welcoming, like not just saying you can come, some people will say you're all are welcome, but most people who say all are welcome say all are welcome if you come and act, think, talk just like we do, right? But if we can actually say all are welcome, come as you are, there's a seat for you at the table, we would love to learn from you. That is a very different thing. And that sense of inclusion and belonging becomes really, really powerful, and it can strengthen the communities in which those people are a part.
Beautiful. Yeah, well said. And the other piece I'd add to that is that some folks will say you're welcome, but the trade-off is you must come and bring your deficits or what we perceive to be your damage. And as long as you allow us to be one up on you, in other words, be a volunteer, be a helper, and you continue to be in the space of being helped, needy, deficient, then we're very happy to include you. And this is a way of keeping people at a distance. Whenever you see a community of folks where there's a clear distinction between those that are being helped and those that are doing the helping, and those that are doing the helping require nothing of those that are helped, that's not a community, that's a charity. And I think that's one of the things that needs some kind of reconciliation in an awful lot of our modern conversations, where we really move past the damage narrative and the deficit narrative, and we start recognizing that the welcome for the stranger at the edge is the recognition that they have gifts that we cannot do life without, that actually our lives are enriched by that diversity. It's not just an act of charity, or dare I say, an act of seeming pious, but it's an act of genuine recognition that we need each other, that we're interdependent rather than independent.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you're part of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, an asset-based perspective that's so different than the deficit perspective. And the deficit model, that's a framework that so many people function under. And I think people probably function under that mindset and framework, from a place of good intention, perhaps, but there are you could articulate for us all the problems with a deficit-based approach, and taking an asset-based approach is just so much healthier in so many ways. And you mentioned something about really it's bringing everyone in and inviting the stranger from the edge in, that leads to, and that can add to this idea of us developing the good life. Can you talk more about that? What does the good life mean to you? Now, obviously, everyone probably has different goals. They have different aspirations, different values. So the particulars of the quote unquote good life is probably as unique as every individual on this planet. But what are some of those components that you feel are important in this conception of a good life?
One of the things, and it's probably helpful in thinking about what a good life looks like, generally speaking, whether you're in the context of an institution or you're outside in the context of friends, family, and that more informal sense of community there. I think one of the things that people feel when they experience a good life is that sense that they are in a lot of reciprocal relationships where they don't feel those relationships are managed. That's number one. So you might say, I often think that in life, wherever we're moving through, that there are three pretty identifiable spaces that we move within. One is managed space. I got to watch my P's and Q's. There's customs and practice here. I'll get punished if I do this. I'll get rewarded if I do that. Then there's private space. At its best, it can be solitude, nothing like, sitting in a corner at the end of the day, reading a nice book, having your own space. But at its worst, it can become the dark night of the soul, where we're completely isolated. So that's the second. So from managed space to private or personal space. The third one, I think, is shared space. And I think the more we have a sense of shared space, appropriate personal space, and not too much managed space, the balance between these three, the more people, I think, would describe their subjective experience as having a good life. Shared space is an interesting one, because I think shared space is less about contract less about I do it because I'm paid, and more about moving through the world at the speed of trust.
Mm.
So it feels very much, to use that gift economy idea, it feels like you're much more in flow, and you're moving with relational welfare rather than I'm doing this because I'm salaried and I'm working with other salaried strangers. But there's more of a sense of collaboration, more of a sense of creation. And it's less about accountability and more about choosing to be accountable to something that is a shared purpose that's bigger than my self-interest. Doesn't mean self-interest is a bad thing, but we're working towards a greater purpose than my narcissistic intent or yours.
Mhm.
So that's a broad brushstroke description of the good life. In practice, we often talk about this idea that if you're experiencing the good life, you feel yourself as an agent, not as a client of somebody
Yeah.
else's agency.
Yeah.
So you have this sense of I can create, I can make, I can influence, but I can also create the conditions within which other people can. So I know how to contribute to, and sometimes to sacrifice space to create the space for a collective creation, whether that's a project at work or, setting up a neighborhood watch in your neighborhood or whatever, whatever the endeavor might be. As some people describe that as volunteering, but I think it's something that's much more substantive than that.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
and so I think when people have those experiences, they might cumulatively say, "Hey, I'm living the good life." The good life isn't just human centric.
Yeah.
The good life has some kind of an embodied sense of how I am within my surroundings and how I impact my surroundings and how my surroundings impact me. So there's that sense that, we are paying attention to our relationship at that level as well, not just human to human.
Yeah, you said something a moment ago that really resonated with me, moving through the world at the speed of trust. But this idea of trust being so foundational to everything that we do in community building, everything, again, neighborhood community building, as well as organizational community building. You do not build community unless you have trust, unless you can develop that relational care amongst people within that community. Can you speak a little bit more to that idea of
Yeah,
moving through the world at the speed of trust? I just love that
yeah,
idea.
yeah. I'm happy to, and I think it's important to think about scale in this sense that it's really interesting that past a certain scale, we have to take what would be the glue of trust, and we've got to replace it with something else like centralized bureaucracy or networks, where you have a centralized administrator or indeed an AI or a digital way of administering, because you're moving past the threshold where everybody feels that the only way this enterprise is going to work is if we all pitch in and contribute and
Mhm.
we assume the best of each other. So we trust each other to essentially keep this enterprise together. So that idea that the trust is the glue, and past a certain scale, as I say, money becomes the glue. And some people say this to me. I do a lot of organizational development work as well, and very much would use the lens of community to hold up and say, "Hey, look at your organization through this and see what way you see the world." And a lot of people would say, "Hey, our organization, the glue of our organization is trust." So I think one of the ways to test that is stop paying staff. Stop paying staff for 2 weeks and see whether trust is sufficient. And I think you'll find it isn't. But we in my neighborhood and in friendship groups where we organize a soccer, uh, game every Monday evening, that is the level and the scale at which I think you can manage to do all kinds of things. Now, interestingly, there is a side show or a behind the curtain show that goes on in every organization, even where money is exchanged. And that's where, in all kinds of senses, in goodwill and good faith, people are creating workarounds and they're doing things to watch out and care for each other. But they're not doing that because they're paid. And a great test of that is the work to rule. So, instead of going on full out strike, just working to your contract. And then you start realizing if people just worked to their contract, in other words, they did what they're paid to do, it would be a disaster. And so you begin to see that trust actually is what makes the world go round and keeps the world, in a sense, in some way, coherent and intact. And obviously, when that breaks down, it really is massively consequential, and no amount of money is going to fix that. That's one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about the organizational piece, is that so often we try to fix the trust deficit with technical fixes, when in fact it may be, we see this constantly in organizations, but in communities too, where the different parts of the organization have become factionalized into silos. See this with local governments in particular, where one part of the local government really just can't stand the other function down the hall.
Right.
And sometimes the best way to heal that is actually to do something that is convivial, that's congenial, that's not about, getting Accenture or KPMG or whatever to come in and facilitate a team building day, but is like, let's go and, do something together. So I think that piece around building trust is really key. But there's a more serious dimension to the building of trust as well. And I think that's also giving people permission to say no, to know that they're in a culture where they can dissent. And I think that really is the kind of the final threshold question. I can get along here, I can have fun. But if I need to, and if I have to say no, will my no be received and will it be heard? If the answer is no, then ultimately you're not passing the sniff test when it comes to trust.
Yeah, you're describing a situation where there's no psychological safety. So people have to feel safe to be able to dissent. And you also articulated very well, like there's interpersonal trust. There's also institutional trust. There's the mechanisms of institutions through policies, practices, and procedures that can either further develop, that institutional trust or erode it. and the interplay between those interpersonal and institutional trust factors, it can be complicated, and it's very, very important to consider. Now, I note the time. I'm going to have to let you go here in a few minutes. It's almost your weekend, and I know you have plans with your family. Maybe as we close, I just want to give you a chance to share with the audience maybe a couple practical tips that they can use as they go out to start creating more meaningful and connected community.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. I think one is we often hear in modern life, bring your whole self to work. So my first tip is don't buy that. You're actually quite entitled to hold some stuff back for your family, for your friends, and for your community outside of work. And that's important if you ever get sick, or if you ever retire, or if you have a life outside of work. You actually, you need to fill your own cup in order to fill the cup of others. So that's a key piece. If you're moving through your neighborhood and your community, particularly outside of work, and you're finding that you're doing that almost like a tourist on a bus with the curtains closed, then maybe there's parts of the good life that you're not experiencing. So some of this, keep some gas in the tank for your own community, because in all kinds of ways, this is the second point, there are all kinds of invisible kickbacks or paybacks or rewards, or just experiences of joy that you can discover in your local community of place or of affinity that's really hard to discover within the limits of a managed space, like a contractual relationship in an institution. It's possible, I've said that already, but it's not always the same. So I think that's the second tip, is to recognize that part of the possibility here is to make visible what's often invisible. So the third piece is that modern life places a value on the marketplace, on what you can produce to the marketplace and what you can consume from the marketplace. So my third tip really is to recognize we are not primarily consumers of the marketplace or producers in the marketplace, that actually life is much more expansive. And I think when we think about ourselves as citizens in local places, in biospheres, and in relation to our neighbors, as well as obviously in the workplace, then I think we open a scope of possibility out, which is incredibly exciting and very rewarding. Helps us get towards the good life, as we were talking about earlier on, John.
Yeah, well said. Cormac, this has just been a real pleasure. As we wrap things up, I just want to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, where they can find your book, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Great. So there's a couple of different things that folks can do to be in touch with us. Both of my books, Rekindling Democracy, The Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space, which may be of interest to people working in organizations. The Blue Book is available at the usual on the usual platforms. And the more recent book that we've been talking about today, The Connected Community, is really an orientation guide for how you can build community of affinity and place in your local neighborhood, or indeed your local group. So I would say both of those are available. Do check them out, and they're pretty much good value for the investment. We also have a lot of stuff that's just free online, so you can look me up by name, Cormac Russell, or you can check out my social enterprise, which is nurturedevelopment.org. That's nurturedevelopment.org, and we can put some, further information in the notes. Also, more recently, we've started a podcast, myself and my co-host, Sasha DeWolf, out at Mount Allison. And we're interviewing all kinds of really cool people from around the world who are living into the connected community. And we're on episode 3, so check that out as well. It's called the Connected Community Podcast.
Wonderful. Cormac, thank you so much. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Cormac can do for you, check out the books. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.